So welcome to part 3 of the drawing a horse with coloured pencils tutorial. In this video I am going to take you through how I created the neck area of this horse. So this is the reference photo that I'm using. It's one of my own photographs. You can see there are quite a few variations of colour in the fur, the highlights, there's sort of some nice dapples in there, lots of shadow, especially underneath the mane area, and there are sort of oranges, there's some dark blues in there, there's some dark reds. So my main colours for this particular area of the horse will be burnt ochre, terracotta. These are from the Polychromos range, the Faber-Castell Polychromos range. I'll be using ivory, cinnamon, caput mortuum, dark indigo, caput mortuum violet for some of these lovely dark areas, Indian red, which is a fabulous red that works really nicely over the orangey colours. What else will I use? Probably some sanguine, maybe some violet-y colours in there, and I will just be layering the colours up. I'll probably add in, I don't know, maybe 10-15 layers in places. Layering and layering. It will start off quite rough, as you'll see when we get into the video, and it will end up looking really nice and smooth. I'll also be adding in probably some Caran d'Ache luminance pencils in there, the white or the buff titanium, whichever one seems to work the best when I start to use it, orange glaze, that type of thing at the end. So those are the sorts of colours I'll be using. I'm working on the dark grey pastel matte board. The piece I did was probably around 14 by 19 inches, so it was quite big. Yeah, so we will crack on. Okay, so starting on the horse's neck, this is going to be a really good video showing you how to layer all sorts of different colours over the top of each other to create really nice smooth looking horse hair. We're starting off with a very light layer. This is the Polychromos burnt ochre, and you can see I'm using a really light pressure. I've got my fingers at the sort of like the top end of the pencil, near the end, and I'm kind of using the pencil on its side, and I'm just going always in the direction of the fur, which is really important, and it's a good idea just to have a look at the way the horse's fur works on the neck, because it does change direction quite subtly as you're going down. So 1 minute is kind of going almost horizontal, and then all of a sudden it starts to go vertical as it comes down towards the shoulder. So it's really important to study how a horse's hair falls, you know, and how it falls over the muscles and everything. So there's a really large muscle that sits on the top of that neck there, and also there's sort of like a bulgy bit just behind the cheek where the vertebrae sits. So the vertebrae doesn't sit on the top where the mane is, it sits sort of like quite a way down, and then all of the bit on the top of the vertebrae is muscle. So it's quite interesting to have a look at the structure of a horse and how the muscles work and how the bone structure underneath the muscles and the skin work, because that's really going to help you with getting the lay of the hair right over the top. So these first few layers are quite boring really. It's literally just about covering the paper, very light layers, following the direction of the hair. And I tend to work on, especially with the neck area, I'll work on a portion of the neck rather than the whole neck as one. So with my first few layers, you'll see I'm working on this top part of the neck, and then I go on and work on the lower bit of the neck. But the first few layers I will work over the whole of the area that I've chosen. So that's sort of like the top of where the poll is down, you know, towards the left here where the mane stops. So I'll work on the the layers, the first sort of probably 2 or 3 layers, I'll cover the whole area, and then I'll start to work sort of finer details, really. Not that we go into huge detail on the neck anyway, but I'll then break down this section that I've chosen to begin with. I'll break it down into smaller sections and then work through that. That's just how I choose to work. You know, you might find that you work in a different way, and that works better for you. So and that's absolutely fine. You know, you work how you like to work and how it works for you. So I'm just going to speed up this little bit here, just so that I can finish this section with the burnt ochre, and then I'll slow it down again once we start on the next layer, just so it doesn't become really boring, really. Okay, so this is the ivory polychromos going in here, and I'm just starting to add in just a few of the sort of like the little highlighty bits, just so that I know you know where the highlights are, what I'm doing, what bits you can go light over dark, and we do go light over dark a little bit later, but just to get those initial really light bits in to begin with is quite a good idea. And I prefer to use the ivory rather than the white, just because it's easier to layer over. The white polychromos can get a little bit shiny, you know, and it can be a little bit challenging to layer over the top of, which is why I use the ivory. So what you can see when I'm layering the ivory in is I'm leaving sort of gaps between my pencil strokes. So what I'm not doing in these initial layers is completely covering the paper. I'm leaving these little areas of where I'm not filling the pencil in on the paper, and that just helps me with the direction of the fur again. And also when I start to layer in another colour over the top, you get the variance in colour. So you're not getting one colour straight over the top of another flat colour. There's a variance in tonal qualities underneath it, and I've kind of worked in this way for quite some time, and I've found it's really, really effective way of creating fur. You can see here again we're back with the burnt ochre here, sort of like just popping it over the top of some of these the creamy bits, not obliterating the cream altogether. And you can see there what I was kind of describing. Some bits are a little bit darker because they're straight onto the dark grey pastel mat. Some pieces are a little bit lighter where the cream has gone in there, and obviously I'm drawing off the edge of the page there, which is a little bit unfortunate, but you know, you can see what I'm talking about there. You're really starting to get some lovely tonal qualities in there of the fur, and that works really, really well, and I'll do that throughout. So here we are coming on to layer 2 of this area of the neck, and we're using the burnt ochre again. Again, light layers over the top of. Now sometimes the pressure can change slightly, so if you've got an area of shadow, then you know, increase the pressure slightly, which is going to give you those lovely tonal qualities straight away. I like to add in some of the darkest shadows, as it gives me a really good indication as to how strong to go with my mid-tones. So this is just the walnut brown, just adding in here along the headpiece of this head collar. Just when it first goes on to the pastel mat, I'm using quite a sharp point here, but it still can be a little bit sort of furry, a bit gritty, just because it's the first layer, you know, and it can look a little bit sort of you know, fluffy around the edges, but the more layers that you add, the sharper those lines will come. But this just gives me an indication here for the shadow area, and it's a very soft shadow area, so I'm not adding in a big thick black line, which is why I've gone for the walnut brown, really, just to add in sort of like a subtle shadow, really. So for areas of shadow like this, because it's going to be a flat colour, I'm not so worried about following the direction of the fur, because you're not going to be able to see any fur detail under this, because it will be a flat colour. This is the dark sepia that I'm putting in here, just to kind of, what I'm trying to do is sort of like have a graduated shadow, so it's obviously darker at the edge of the leather headpiece, kind of blending out lighter, which is where the walnut brown is. So one of my absolute favourite colours, especially for animal fur, for like chestnut bays, you know, those sort of orangey coloured animals, is the terracotta, the polychromos terracotta. And actually this is a really great pencil for using on the pastel mat as well, because it goes down really quite smoothly right from the beginning. I'm not sure whether you can see on the video here, but so we're on to layer 3. I'm not going to keep on saying, oh, we're layer 3, layer 4, layer 5, but this is, you know, we're very early into the layering stage here, and you can already see, I'm not sure whether you can see or not, but you can I can tell that this particular colour is starting to smooth out the colours underneath. So again, following the direction of the fur. Very light layers, and also the strokes that I'm using kind of replicate the length of the fur that I'm drawing. So I'm not drawing great big long lines, although this is going to be quite smooth at the end, so it's not as if we can see all of the tiny little lines, but I'm trying to replicate the length of the fur on this horse's neck, which I think is quite important really to get sort of realistic looking fur. So just speeding up this process again, just while we get this this layer down. I'm using exactly the same technique, the same pressure throughout, just covering those other couple of layers there. There may be times where I increase the pressure slightly, you know, just when I get to maybe a bit of darker fur, but on the whole it's the same pressure all the way through. So coming back to the caput mortuum, so this is sort of like quite a dusky red, like a dark pinky red, and it really is a fabulous foundation for brown fur, for using in shadows, for using over the top of other warm colours, and over the top of the orange as well. It kind of, its colour shines through, but you also still get the lovely glow of the terracotta coming through as well from underneath, which is what I really love about layering, and I love about the pencils, the luminosity, the way that the colours shine through. Just picking out those bits again, so over the top of that dark sepia and the walnut brown in that shadow area, just adding another layer of a different colour. It just adds to the I suppose the realism, you know, the quality of the colour that's going into the piece. It just adds to it using all of these different colours. I don't know. I honestly don't think I would get the same result just going in with a colour that potentially matched what the horse's coat colour was. And actually, I don't think I've got a pencil that is that colour anyway. So what you can see now is I'm actually going into this next layer, and I'm placing my pencil marks quite carefully. So this horse has got sort of some dapples throughout his coat. So I am placing the colours in the direction of the fur still, but missing out bits, and almost sort of very lightly sketching in the outsidey bits of those dapples. You'll be able to see as we go along, and this again just gives me a good base foundation for when I add some further layers, you know, and we can build further onto those dapples and darken them up a little bit. So I'm going to speed this bit up again. You can still see what I'm doing. We're still using the same strokes, the same pressure, slightly, you can see there I've gone in slightly harder, and when I go in with a harder pressure, you can see me moving my fingers up the pencil, which just gives me a little bit more control, and I can add a little bit more pressure onto the point of the pencil. So I'll just speed this bit up a bit, and then I'll slow it down again when we come to another bit that I can explain. So you can see here I'm just adding in some more layers just underneath this bit of the mane, and I'm using the Caput Mortuum Violet on this bit as well, just to kind of darken that area and blend into this neck area that I'm starting to work on now. Obviously this is quite a dark shadow, but you don't want to have like a really dark line under there. So you know, just building those up gradually and then working your way out into the neck is going to give you that nice sort of graduation from the dark to the light. You can see the terracotta here working very nicely over the top. So this is kind of giving you a really nice example actually of how you can blend all of the colours together. So you've got layers of dark indigo, Caput Mortuum, you've got a little bit of the terracotta, and now we've got the Caput Mortuum Violet, using still a light pressure, and all we're doing now is it's almost like moving the pigment around on this paper, with it being quite a toothy textured paper. The pigment sits almost on the top, so I'm almost pulling down as I'm adding the pigment. I'm using my pencil just to pull all of that, all of those colours together and blend them all, and that's much easier to do in the when you started to add quite a few layers. In the earlier layers it's not so easy, but once you've got a few layers of different colours, it's much easier to blend. So this is the terracotta again, coming in a slightly heavier pressure. What you'll find now when you get into these further layers is that the paper starts to disappear, the paper colour starts to disappear, and also it really does start to smooth out, so the colours start to blend together. So this is where your layering and your blending come into play. So I'm not burnishing or anything like that. All I'm doing is very lightly moving the pigment around and blending all of those colours together that I've put down one on top of the other. You kind of get to understand which colours work best with other colours, you know, what colours to use for different furs, what colours to use to help blend, because there are some colours that do blend out easier than others and work really well. Again, going back to the ivory, and you can see here how easy it is to get light over dark, and that will continue as you carry on the layering process. You can continue to add in light colours over the darker ones, which is it's a brilliant thing to be able to do. So here I'm coming in with a Polychromos Cinnamon, which is one of my definite go-to colours for sort of bright beige and chestnut fur. Over the top of the terracotta and the ivory gives a really lovely glow and a really nice tone. So when you've got your highlights, they're not sort of like bright white or or too creamy. The highlights really work very nicely with the rest of the colours, and just sort of combining and when I was talking at the beginning about having a section and then starting to concentrate on smaller sections within that section, this is what I'm starting to do now. So I've got a few layers down over the whole entire section I've chosen to work on, and now I'm starting to work on these smaller sections, building in some of the shadow detail, the highlight detail, which then eventually you'll end up with sort of like much more of the fur detail in there as you're adding the layers. And that is something to remember, especially when using this sort of paper. The details don't come in the first few layers, and that can be quite frustrating and quite challenging. I mean, obviously, if you choose to put the details in first, then and if it works, then great. But I've found that the details don't come until you start adding in the layers, because the paper then smooths out a little bit, and you can use all of the different colours on there, and then you can start to really build in those lovely tonal qualities in there as you're going along. So working with the ivory Polychromos, again building in this area of highlight on the top of the neck here, again in the direction of the fur a little bit. You can see I'm using a little bit harder pressure here. My fingers have kind of gone down to the nearer to the end of the pencil here, and I'm still putting in very short strokes to replicate the length of the hair on the reference photo, which again is it's important to do that, because that if I was putting great big long strokes in, it's not going to look like horsehair. So it's kind of common sense, but actually it's very easy to get carried away. I've done some portraits before where I've got really carried away, and then I've gone, oh gosh, I've got some really weird looking hair in here, because you just get lost in the moment, and and off you go with the music you're listening to, or or whatever. So you can see I'm using little strokes. Again, I'm not covering the entire surface. The other thing I'm not doing is I'm not intending to draw every single piece of fur or hair. It's just my pencil strokes, and I'm letting my pencil strokes help me create the look of the horse's fur, because obviously the pencil strokes are very fine. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I'll have areas where the texture might be a little bit closer together, and then I'll have areas where it looks like there's a few sort of strands of hair that that you can see. And also by doing this, again, like I was saying before, you leave the little gaps, and then when you go in with another colour, you're almost adding a further colour in there as well, because it's going over the top of the lighter colour, and then it's also filling in the gaps that you've left behind, and that's what's going to give you this realistic looking fur. So just working on this area here, the back to the terracotta, and it is all about the layering. It is all about adding a colour, adding another colour, adding another colour, adding another colour, and adding the light over the dark over the light. You get to smooth out your you smooth out all and help blend all of your pencils as well. This is Indian red, which is another favourite colour of mine for bay horses. It's just a really good colour, combined with the oranges and the pinks. It gives this really nice, rich, darker orangey a feel to the coat, and just adding, I'm starting to add in sort of like little touches now, and really following my reference photo and looking at these different tonal qualities within the fur, so these little dappley areas. Now I'm starting to add areas of lighter colour, areas of darker colour, you know, and also following the hair direction. So you can see in this area here, this part of the horse here is where the vertebrae connects onto the horse's skull, so you get a rounded area, and again the direction of the fur changes here as well, so it comes down and then it starts to go almost vertical. So pulling in a little bit more of that Caput Mortuum violet, again helping it blend, pulling in you know, these shadow areas underneath the mane here, you know, using a little bit more pressure and going over the edges, you know, so you're getting these lovely soft edges rather than a harsh edge. And if you go in too dark, that's not a problem. You can go back in, you know, with a lighter colour and lighten it back up again. It's not an issue at this stage at all. And using it very, the pressure again is still very light. The paper, I think I've mentioned before, it almost grabs the pigment from the pencil, you know, so it goes down very nicely. I'm using this sort of sketchy stroke up near this shadow area here. I'm not following the direction of fur up here. What I'm trying to do is blend all of those colours together. So using this sort of more sketchy feel helps to the blending, and helps to kind of soften everything. And then obviously when I come back down into the main area of the neck, you know, making sure that I do follow the direction of the fur. And all the way through this horse's coat, it's not the same all the way through. There are all sorts of patches of light and dark, and that's now what I'm starting to try and build in, which is much easier at this stage when you've got lots of layers down, because you can blend out those edges, you know, rather than trying to go in and put dark dapples in first and then try and blend them out, you know, at the beginning. That's much harder to do, especially on this paper. This is the dark indigo again. I use a lot of the dark indigo in my brown horses. I find that the dark indigo combined with the Caput Mortuum and the Caput Mortuum violet gives a really, really lovely, deep, rich chocolatey brown, and sometimes if you feel you've got a little bit too much blue in there, you can put a glaze of the walnut brown over the top just to knock it back a little bit, but I think it just gives it an extra dimension, really, using these different colours to create a brown rather than trying to find a brown that matches. And I'm not that keen on the browns that come with all of the different brands. They have their uses, obviously, but I tend to try and make my own. You can see as well that I'm not always using pencils with a really sharp point. At this particular stage, when you're layering, I don't find that it's necessary to have really, really sharp points on your pencils. And in fact, sometimes when you've got quite a relatively blunt pencil, it's quite useful, and for the blending process, it works quite nicely. Using the cinnamon here, not necessarily to add colour, but to help just blend in those darker pencils that I've just added the Caput Mortuum there, just to help blend that into the under layers. Obviously it will add a little bit of colour, but it's that's the reason that I tend to use pencils like this at this stage, is to help with the blending process. And then the ivory again, just to sort of bring that highlight back up a little bit over the top of the other pencils, works really, really nicely. So I'm adding touches here of burnt sienna, polychromos still, over the top of the colours that I've already added in. This stage is just about building those tonal values in. It's the sculpting of the piece. It's getting all of the hairs going in the right direction. It's the colours over the top of the colours, and this is what is going to make your piece look really realistic and your fur look fantastic. But it is a very slow process, even with smooth papers. It's a slow process, but it's so worth it. I know this neck has probably taken me, oh gosh, there's probably around 5 hours, something like that, to complete it, maybe a little bit less than that, but it's so satisfying when you start to see how the whole piece is going to look, just from the blank paper and those initial layers. I mean, you can see those initial layers there, they look so rough and gritty and grainy and horrible, but just after a few layers and just adding your different pencils over the top of it, it really does start to look like shiny fur, and that's what I love about this paper and coloured pencils. Yes, it's slow, but you get a really, really great result. So again, I'm just speeding this up. all I'm doing here is exactly the same as I've done before. I'm using, there's terracotta, there's the Indian red, and I'm just building up those layers in this area and then starting to work down a little bit. So always following the reference photo, you know, building those colours in where I can see them, darker pressure where those shadows are. So at the top of the neck you're looking at sort of like a darker shadow, and then adding the colours, but then adding the shine over the top with the ivory, and then just adding touches again of like the burnt sienna, the caput mortem, just to continue building those layers and smoothing them out. So just going in again with the caput mortem, building in the areas that are going to form the dapples, smoothing again with the terracotta, and just keeping on building up those layers, building in the shadow areas, and then adding in the highlights again, just to create the semblance of real fur. So this is burnt sienna. You can see I'm coming in with very light pressure again. The pencil is on the side, and I'm using this sort of backwards and forwards stroke, but little tiny strokes to replicate those the shorter hairs on the neck, and just going over that terracotta, over the other layers, and just building up the fur on the horse's neck. Here you can really start to see where I am adding in those areas of the Caput Mortuum violet, which will be the dapples. So I've been building them very lightly as I'm building the layers, and as the more layers are being added, you can see the detail coming through even more. So back to real time here, and you can see how I am adding in those darker areas, those dappley areas over the top of the other layers. So you're still incorporating all of those colours underneath it, and you're getting a much richer dapple than if you'd just gone straight in with sort of like a dark red, and you're getting all of those other colours shining through, which is what happens with horses' fur. There's all sorts of different colours in there, and by using these techniques, although it's slow, you are going to get that lovely range of colours shining through. Again, it's very light pressure. The direction of the strokes in the direction of the fur. I think the pressure is really key, when you're layering, because if you do go in too heavy-handed, you're going to get a lot of pigment down, and it is going to be a struggle to put in further layers. With the pastel mat, it's you can get a lot of layers in there, but if you go in too heavy, you're going to go in too dark too quickly, and you're not going to use the paper to its best advantage, in my opinion, to get an effect like this. I mean, obviously, if you want to use a heavier pressure, then by all means, if you're getting the effect you want, well, that's absolutely fantastic. Coming in with the Indian red over the top of that Caput Mortuum violet, again, it's going to help smooth it out. It's going to help blend in all of those colours, and you're really starting to get a nice, rich, bright chestnut to this this horse's neck now. You can still see all of the oranges coming through. You can see the reds coming through, and they're all blending really, really nicely. Using the dark indigo again just to pull out some of those darker areas. Obviously the dark blue over the red, it's going to sort of like make a really dark reddy colour, and it's almost, I feel it makes a really, really lovely sort of dark browny colour, and it just adds just so much depth because you can still see the other colours shining through. So back to real time here, and you can see the strokes that I'm using and how adding these colours in again as a lighter layer is really helping to smooth and blend all of the other layers underneath, and you're really starting to get this this lovely smooth looking fur. The light layers of the dark indigo again just to sort of pull out those darker areas, and at this point it's just about adding in the tonal qualities of the fur. I mean, obviously on the neck there's not a huge amount of detail as such. It's all about the fur direction, it's all about the colours, it's all about the shadows and the highlights. So you can really start to see here where the direction of the fur is changing. The top of the neck, the fur sort of like glides almost sort of vertically along the same line the neck's following, and as it comes over that big piece of muscle and where the vertebrae sits, it starts to round and then come down almost vertically downwards. And that's, as I said before, it's really, really important to take notice of the direction of the fur, because again that's another little piece of the jigsaw in creating drawings that look realistic. You'll see as well with this dark indigo that I'm putting in, again I'm not covering all of the area that I'm adding to. I'm adding quite roughly, so I'm sort of sketching those hairs in, and then as I come along with a different coloured pencil, those hairs will then be blended, so they won't look like lines, they'll be blended in, but they won't be solid blocks of colour. Something to be aware of: if you do go in quite heavy handed by mistake, so if you do go in with a little bit more heavier pressure than you anticipated, and your pencil goes in a little bit darker than you'd want it, you can still at this stage, well throughout the whole stage, you can use your putty eraser just to dab over that area where you've got a little bit too much pigment, just to lift it out a little bit. Do be careful though of pressing too hard on this paper, because you will indent it, and you will it might then be quite difficult to you'll probably be able to see the mark, is what I'm trying to say. So just be you know, just be cautious with your pressure. So coming in here with a little bit more, the strokes are a bit more deliberate. This is the caput mortuum, so I'm using a slightly stronger pressure here. You can see how I'm holding my pencil, so I'm holding it nearer the end and still on its side slightly, but I'm going in and making deliberate marks rather than the sketchy marks that I was making before. And that's because there are areas that I want to smooth out, I want to blend. So you can see here I'm blending that patch of the dappled area, I'm blending all of those colours together, not necessarily, you know, making hard marks over the top, but I'm using my pencil to pull all of those different coloured pigments together, and that's what's then helping me to blend. Now I suppose at this point, if you were using a a smooth paper, you could look at burnishing, you know, with either a colourless blender, a colourless blending pencil, or sort of like a white luminance or something like that, and that's when you would then help blend everything together, and you'd burnish it. But with how I use the pencils on this particular paper, I sometimes use a blender if I feel like it. I think I've used sort of like a soft tool on this, just to kind of almost smudge things, you know, like as if it was a pastel painting, something like that. And if by magic, here we have a soft tool. That was funny. So yeah, so all I'm doing, obviously this is the edge of the portrait, and I don't want a harsh line. You know, I want a really nice soft fading out effect. So I'm using the Pan Pastel soft tool here, just to soften out all of that pigment. A lot of it comes off onto the actual tool itself, but you get this lovely soft effect. You could use your fingers to blend it out, but you might find it easier to use a tool like this, or maybe a piece of you know, cotton rag or something like that, just to kind of blend it out, or even a putty eraser. Putty eraser is great for softening edges and just lifting off a little bit. But you can see that lovely effect there has given the edge of that portrait, so you're not getting like a really harsh line. It really softens it out. And then I'm just using it, it's not something I do on a regular basis, but just using it to kind of soften those areas there. The thing with the soft tools is, so if I took this and I just dragged it over everything, it would lift off quite a lot of those pencil layers. So using it very gently, and in places where, you know, you just need to soften it out a little bit, but very gently, because it does lift off that pigment, you know, and you don't want to lose any of those layers that you've put down. But it is quite nice just to soften it off, you know, in places if you need to do. So you can see here now, as I am adding more of the colour in, and this is either I think it's a burnt sienna. No, it's not, it's Caput Mortem. When you're now adding the colours in over the top of all of these layers, you can see how it is starting to be, the application of the pencil is starting to be really quite smooth, whereas when you first started it was very sparse, it was quite grainy. This is the whole point about, and this is why coloured pencil artists, or a lot of coloured pencil artists, love the pastel mat, because of the layering qualities, because you can add all of these layers and get those gorgeous colours coming through, and it only takes a few layers before it really starts to soften up, you know, and you get this lovely sheen shining through, and all those colours coming through. So you can see here, this is the Polychromos Sanguine that I'm using here, which is a really gorgeous pinky orange. And those gaps that I've left when I've been adding those first few layers, the gaps that I left in between, you can start to I want to say fill them in, I don't really mean fill them in, but you can start to kind of cover them up, and then you get the look of the horse's fur coming through. So it's not lines of pencil, but it starts to look like individual hairs, even though you haven't drawn individual hairs. You know, and the Sanguine again is a great pencil for blending those colours in, and it works really nice with the dark indigo. You have to be quite careful with the cooler and the warmer colours. So dark indigo directly over the top of say the terracotta, if you haven't got a a reddy colour underneath or in between those, you can get a bit of a green tinge. But the sanguine, I find, with the dark indigo, you don't get the greeny tinge. So that's a really great colour to use, you know, with the dark indigo, sort of like in shadowy areas, that type of thing. So the first time I've used brown on this brown horse, this is the walnut brown, and I think I mentioned before, just to glaze over the top of like the caput mortuum and the dark indigo, just kind of knocks it back a little bit, but you're not getting sort of like a solid brown, but you're getting a glaze of this brown. And this is there are quite a few browns in the Polychromos range, and this is my favorite. This is the one that I use. If I'm going to use brown, this is the one that I use. Just literally glazing, very, very lightly glazing over the top of all of those layers. And again, by doing this, it's starting to pull all of the colours in underneath, and it just leaves a very, very subtle sheen of colour over the top. So just speeding up the video again, and you can see that's all I'm doing is just adding in the walnut brown over the top, just as a glaze over the areas, just pulling out those dapples again, and then back in with the caput mortuum violet just to sort of richen up those areas again. And then switch into this red violet, beautiful colour that just again it just will pull out the colours that you've got underneath. Really complements the oranges and the dark blues that you've got in there, you know, just in little patches. You don't need it all over, it's just in areas, and it's everybody sees colour differently. So you know, if you see a particular colour within the reference photo and you want to use it and it works for you, well then, you know, go ahead and use it. I do like to use violets, dark reds, dark blues in my brown horses. So pulling out the highlights again, adding a bit of a sheen over, sort of like a glaze over the top, and you can see how wonderfully you can work light over dark, and how you know, with very light pressure you're still getting you know, the cream shining through. So you can add in